But that idea that she could pick something up and possibly put it in her sculpture and not really know what it was, and then that gives you a mystery to be solved immediately. There's this mysterious bone that's there, and like, what is it? Where did it come from? Did she know what she was putting into her work?
Welcome to our latest episode of Book Reporter Talks To, where our guest today is Paula Hawkins, and we are going to be talking about fabulous new thriller, The Blue Hour, which is a Book Reporter Bets On selection. I really enjoyed this book. I had the pleasure of meeting Paula in New York when she was there for her pre-pub tour, and we had a lovely conversation. I said, I really want you to do the show. So I'm so glad to have her here. Talk her to the day before publication, before the book's release. So I don't have a Book Reporter review yet. We'll have that for Friday. So I'm going to share some praise from some other sources, like Lee Child, who said, the best Paula Hawkins yet by a tense and haunting mile. Love that. And Liz Moore, the author of God of the Woods, said, an atmospheric, stylish puzzle of a thriller, truly exceptional. I completely agree. And with that, welcome, Paula. So nice to have you here.
For having me. Hi.
So let's start with you telling us about The Blue Hour.
So, The Blue Hour is a psychological suspense thriller. It's set on a remote tidal island off the coast of Scotland. And this is an island that is home to just one house, just one inhabitant. There's only one way out. And at a certain time, it was home to an artist, a woman called Vanessa Chapman. And when the book opens, Vanessa has already died. That's not a spoiler. But there's an exhibition including some of her work at a gallery in London, and a rather gruesome discovery is made about one of her artworks. And this kind of opens the mystery out. So the curator of the museum that owns the piece has to play detective. He has to go to the island where she used to live and try and figure out what went on with her. On this island, he meets her friend, Grace, who lived with her for a time, who was her carer at the end of her life. And this curator, Becca, and Grace kind of form an uneasy partnership as they try and sort of dig into Vanessa's life and try to find out where the bodies are buried, so to speak.
And who was responsible for what and how it all happens. I just love it because
Exactly.
I'm peeling an onion the whole time you're reading this book. It's like, well, what do I know? What don't I know? What am I getting at the heart of it? Now, if I remember correctly, you were on vacation when you got the idea for the book. You had your leg up, I think, in a cast or something, or you'd gotten hurt and you were like stuck in the room while everybody else was outside.
Well, yes, I've been walking on the coast of France, on the coast of Brittany a lot. When I discovered this little island that had just a single house on it, and it was a tidal island, so it was cut off from the mainland when the tide came in. And I thought, oh, this is. I just loved the idea of it, and I thought it was such a great location. And I think the next day I twisted my ankle really badly, so I was then confined to a chair for the rest of the holiday, and I just kept thinking about this little island. And there were lots of things about it that were great for as a crime novel location. It was so beautiful and remote, and there's this kind of locked room possibility you have with a place like that where you can get trapped. But I think the thing that really sort of stuck with me the most was that little house and sort of wondering what kind of person would want to live in a home where you're cut off twice a day when the tide comes in. That time of day changes every day, so you would have to sort of live a very peculiar kind of life, and that really intrigued me. And the more I thought about it, the more I kind of it came to me that this would be a place that an artist might want to live. They would be drawn by the landscape and the solitude, the idea of solitude. And then I moved the island, obviously, to Scotland because I wanted it to be dark and stormy and Scottish, not sun drenched and Mediterranean.
Yeah. And it is because you're thinking about being 12 hours a day and you've got to figure out the hours of the tide. You've got to know what's going on. And I thought of it as an island, but then I learned tidal island because the tide is what cuts it off. Hadn't thought about it like that before.
Yeah.
So the descriptions are so vivid. Like you're figuring, I have to leave now because the tide will be coming in. So a lot is tied into Tide. Okay, into what can and what can't happen on the island at any particular time. You can be trapped, you can be set free, you can do all these things. And I feel like if the island itself became a character in the book because it had the ability to have things happen or not. Am I on a track there?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's definitely what appealed to me. So that the island does, as you say, it becomes a character. It shapes the plot of the novel to some degree, but it also starts to shape the characters, the people who've lived there or near there for a long time. They are also changed in some way by their experiences of the island and by, Vanessa is changed by the experience of living there. Vanessa is the artist, sorry, and Grace, her friend, is changed by the experience of living there. Um, and in good ways and bad, as
Hmm.
I'll let the reader discover that. But it very much was that idea that it's the kind of place that could shape you and would have a real impact on you. And that was very intriguing to me, the sort of asking questions about what it would be like to be cut off and untethered from the world for a long time, to have this kind of slightly strange elemental existence where your every day is not just morning and evening, it's tied to some other atmospheric thing that happens to you, that goes on every day. So you're not you're influenced by weather, by tide, by all sorts of different things. That was intriguing to me.
Yeah, and it's not just treated by, what's going to happen. It's like it has to happen in a certain amount of time. It has to move in a certain amount of time. The opening page, we learned something about one of the art pieces called Division Two from Vanessa. And it's like really right up at the beginning. What was the inspiration for this plot idea? Because I don't know if we can give it away because it's so early, but I mean, it's just like, seriously, this is what we're thinking about in art.
So Vanessa, the artist, she's a woman. She paints, she makes ceramics, she also makes sculpture, and her sculpture she makes out of things that she's found objects. And so I was thinking about her walking in the woods, walking on the beach, picking things up, pebbles and bits of wood and bits of bone. And I'd read this. I was reading an essay on, which was talking about found objects and how people use found objects in various ways. And there was a whole thing about bird skulls and various kinds of bones. And then there was this kind of digression onto how certain kinds of animal bones are very similar to human bones and how they're often people think they found a human bone and actually it's just and then I was thinking, oh well, that's good. That's really intriguing that's perfect for a crime novel, particularly if you're trying to write a crime novel about an artist. And at this point, I didn't really know what I was going to do with her. But that idea that she could pick something up and possibly put it in her sculpture and not really know what it was, and then that gives you a mystery to be solved immediately. There's this mysterious bone that's there, and like, what is it? Where did it come from? Did she know what she was putting into her work?
Mhm.
So it was just one of those things where it was you light on an idea and it's like, oh yes, that's how I get into my novel.
Yeah, this is my way in. This is my path in right now.
Yeah,
Let's walk on the beach
absolutely.
together sometime. I want to see what you see. I come back with shells. I'm like, oh, your love of art definitely comes through on the pages. Your descriptions are so vivid. When you travel, do you go to museums? I mean, I know you're on a tour, a city a day tour right now, but do you like to try to get to museums and see what different people are showing?
If I've ever got spare time in a place, I do like to visit a museum or an art gallery and wander around. And I do find that that's one of the things that I find really inspirational. I think when I just before I started writing this novel, I'd been to an exhibition in London of the American artist Lee Krasner. Um, and she's very well known in the US, but she's less well known in the UK. And I had not seen her work before, and I just thought it was absolutely fascinating and beautiful. And there were these paintings that she'd made, or these big collages that she'd made, having made paintings which she was then unhappy with, and she literally ripped the canvas up and threw it all on the floor and went off. And when she came back to her studio, she looked at these pieces and she realized that she had something there and that she could make something new. And that was really interesting for me, the idea of making things out of broken things that
Mhm.
occurs in the novel, like putting things together. And there was so much when I was reading about Krasner about the way she was received. Um, Obviously, she's a long way before my artist was working, but the way she was received, the way her work was talked about, how she was always in the shadow of her much more famous husband, Jackson Pollock, and so that like gendered discussion of who she was, that also sort of fed into it. And I started reading lots more about different artists and all that, about artists' lives. I read memoirs, biographies, and I borrowed from how the artists wrote about their own work. It was actually really lovely to really immerse myself in that world for a while because I do find it fascinating, and there is so much scope for intrigue and interpretation and conflict
Yeah.
in those kind of worlds.
Yeah, I don't. Is there one style of art you like the most? Like I look sometimes around our house, we have Southwest, or I have this, or I have that. I go through these periods of like, that's the painting I want on the living room wall, and it's still there 30 years later. I still love it.
I think it's an interesting thing once you start um, collecting a bit and you sort of one artist kind of leads to another. I think it's quite similar to books. You sort of start reading somebody and then they reference somebody else and kind of get led down a path. It's mostly like it's modern but not super contemporary kind of 20th century British art that I tend to gravitate towards. But actually, I'm interested in lots of different things.
Hmm.
There's
It's
lots
just
of
me.
extraordinary stuff out there, and it's just there's always more to learn.
If you ever had a chance out on the tip of Long Island, there's Jackson Pollock's studio, if you've ever been there, and it's an amazing tour. And you go in and see where he and Lee lived, and you see the paint splatters on the floor, and you just think of how you were creating that art that was so different from what you were seeing at the time. It was revolutionary.
I would love to go there. I've never been, but I would love to go there.
Yeah, it's like one trip, it's like you have to slow down for like 1 second and say, I want to do something while I'm in New York, besides going and meeting everybody in the media.
Mm. Well, yeah.
It's rough. It's a lot. It's a lot. So Vanessa met Grace when she came to an urgent care. So let's talk about making that connection because I feel like with Grace being a doctor, Vanessa would trust her. Vanessa would like put herself into this woman's hands of heal me, make me feel better, which immediately starts the relationship on a certain track that may not have started if they met each other in the food store and said this grapefruit or this one.
Absolutely. The way they meet is so Vanessa has fallen and broken her wrist, and yeah, she goes to the doctor's surgery, and Grace is the doctor there, the GP. And so yes, it's from the outset, it's a caring relationship. There's a dependency there that is um, so it starts off on a certain footing. And I think one of the things that was really interesting to me when I was writing is how the power dynamics between these two people shift and shift and shift, and how one needs the other, and then the other needs the other person more. And at certain points, they are very close, and at certain points, they really fight. And I think I was really interested in how we write about marriages and love affairs and those kind of things and familial relationships are written about all the time and are written about in huge varieties of ways. And I think friendship is maybe looked at platonic friendship is looked at less. It's just seen as like a good, happy thing. And I think actually, if you look at a friendship that endures over decades, they're not always good and happy, particularly if you've got very difficult characters involved. There are big peaks and troughs in those kind of relationships, and there are betrayals, and there are, intense feelings involved. And so it was interesting to me to look at a relationship like that, a difficult friendship where one party is maybe more invested than the other. But at certain times, they depend on each other in various different ways. So it's all about those power shifts and how those affect the two people.
Yeah, because Grace really blurs the lines a lot between herself and Vanessa. Vanessa's fame, whatever's going on. And she loathes Vanessa's husband, Julian, and she tells her that. Like, I don't like him. I don't want him around. And at one point, I love when she says, when will Julian be out of our lives? And Vanessa retorts, he's not in your life, he's in mine. And it feels like that's really blunt. And it's something that Grace can't bear because she blurs the lines between them, where Vanessa doesn't like quite the same way. Am I right? Because I feel like, wait a second, that's going to be your best friend. I'm your best friend. I'm the one you need.
Yeah, she's so at this point, Vanessa and her husband have been estranged already. So he's not living with her, but he
Right.
comes back. They're one of those couples that don't seem to ever fully be able to extricate each other. And yes, as you say, Grace takes an instant dislike to him, which is not difficult because he's not that likable a man. But she does absolutely see that her and Vanessa's lives are going to be permanently entwined. Whereas for Vanessa, this is it's nice, it's what have you, but it is not such a defining relationship for her. And that is one of the big differences between the two. They're very different people. That Vanessa has lots of friends. She finds that kind of social side of life very easy. People are attracted to her partly because she's physically attractive, but they're also attracted to her because of who she is, because she's this dynamic and slightly enigmatic artist. She's very opinionated, whatnot. Whereas Grace has always struggled to, she's socially awkward. She doesn't make friends easily. And so when now she's made a friend, she, this is so important to her. It's just such an important relationship. And she is unable to see those points where she's overstepping and where she's giving too much of herself or expecting too much of the other person.
Yeah. It's like Grace is looked at as overweight and plain over and over again. And she just hates when she overhears a lot of conversation about herself that really influences like how she feels. So she's carrying this pain about her appearance, how people feel about her. So what you're going to have her look be something that's like so intimidating, like to her. It's like whenever she walks in a room, she's wondering, what are people thinking? Whereas, because her confidence isn't there. And she just looks at Vanessa as glamorous and, poised. Meanwhile, this woman's a doctor. She's done a lot of fabulous things, but it's appearances, once again, is what it's all coming down to.
I think the thing about Grace is that she had like a fairly brutal rejection or two in her sort of young adult life. And she's just not managed to shake off the shame of those things. She feels them as a shame, even though she shouldn't really be ashamed. Other people should be ashamed for treating her badly, but she's one of these people who's internalized that. And she's started, this, she's taken it as, well, there's something wrong with me. And it is partly it is very much, well, it's her physicality that's been commented on, but that's what she's sort of so conscious of.
Hmm.
And yet, as you say, she's accomplished. She's a doctor. She's a vital part of her community. She does good things, but there's always this difficulty for her in that she feels the self consciousness around how looks is seen and how she is perceived. And I think that's something that does happen to people, that there are certain barbs that really sting and they stay with you
Hmm.
for years, which is why people should maybe be a little bit more careful when they're talking about people, because there are certain slights that perhaps you get possibly when you're younger that I think just stay with you, and they're very hard to shake off.
When I was thinking that, I was thinking how social media, I mean, it wasn't around when I was a teen, and to sit there and think about what people say now, like they just spit out, say, and it could have an influence on you. Whereas she overhears things. Things are not said completely to her face. She overhears. Whereas there, it may be you're reading something or you're seeing something that you weren't supposed to see, either that or it's said
Mm.
directly to you. And it's just a different way that
It's a
people
brutal
interact.
it's a
Brutal.
brutal world. I'm glad I didn't there wasn't social media around when I was a teen either, because I imagine that it is fairly brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you're not just not at the party, you're seeing the party. Now you're just not this, you're
Exactly.
not. Yeah. It's really funny. But so when Vanessa dies, Grace is the executor of the estate, her will, her only heir. So she's selecting Grace for what reason? What makes her say, this is the person to, trust the rest of my, career to for where it goes from here?
What she does is she divides her estate. She has her personal effects go to Grace, and her artistic estate is left to a foundation, an art museum. But Grace is the executor, so Grace gets to determine what makes up the artistic estate and what makes up her personal estate. And at the point at which this is done, Vanessa is so she knows she's unwell, she knows she's dying, and Grace is the person who's caring for her. Grace is the person who stays in her house on the island and looks after her. And so I think at this point, Vanessa has also burned bridges with the other people that she was close to. Her husband is long gone. She has fallen out with friends for various reasons. So she's kind of been left in a situation where Grace is her main link to the
Hmm.
world, and so she allows Grace to be the executor. I and yes, this is a position of trust, but so she's had this relationship with Grace that goes back a long way, and it has, as you pointed out, it did start from this position of trust. Um, and also she knows that Grace isn't that interested in the art,
Hmm.
so that she doesn't imagine for a moment that she would meddle.
Yeah, she's not going to do
Grace is
anything
quite
about it.
meddlesome.
So this young man named James Becker from the Fairborn Foundation, which is where the art is charged with figuring out what happened to the sculpture that we were alluding to before and what might be missing from the collection. So he shows up and it's like, I don't want you here, you go. So let's talk about him because he's got this job that he doesn't feel like he's going to be able to accomplish it all because Grace is just standing there like, you got it, what you're getting, and that's all you're getting. End of discussion. Yeah.
So yeah, Kent is the curator at the foundation, and he is sort of this expert of Vanessa's work. He's loved her work since he was a teenager. There are things in his past as well that have connected him to Vanessa's work. And so what he wants more than anything is to be the person who gets to share Vanessa's work with the world, and the person who gets to tell the world about Vanessa's work. And in order, he believes, to do that really properly, he wants to get his hands on her papers, on her diaries, on her letters, all those things, which Grace has said, hang on, that's not the artistic estate, that's her personal estate. That those she's writing personal letters. So there is a point of conflict there. And as you say, when he turns up on the island, he's unannounced. Grace is afraid and she's upset and she's like, nope, you're not coming in. But they actually find common ground because they both love Vanessa in their own way, Becca through the art and Grace the person. They both care about her legacy. They both want the world to see how brilliant she was and what a great person she was because they believe that. Well, lots of the critics wrote about Vanessa in a particular way, about her being difficult, and the way some women are written about it. Um, so there is some common ground between them, but there is also this source of conflict as to who owns what. And Becca slightly manipulatively says, "Oh well, we'll decide together. I'll help you, and we can do this. We could. This can." He almost sells it to Grace like it's a little project. So then, and Grace, who is lonely, as we've talked about, sees this kind of as oh well, he's potentially an ally now. He's being kind to her. He's actually expressing an interest in her opinion, which nobody ever does.
So she's like, oh, wait, maybe this is going to be okay, you know? An author's writing process is always of interest to me. So portions of Vanessa's diary appear throughout the book. Were they there at the start? Did you write them as you were writing the other chapters? Because they tell so much of her story, but it's sometimes they're long, sometimes they're short, sometimes it's just a paragraph. So how did you handle that to let us know more about her?
Yeah, I wanted the reader to be able to learn about Vanessa a bit in her own words, because obviously you see her through Grace's eyes, through Becca's eyes, through the critics' eyes. As I said, there's these articles about her. Um, but I did want the reader to have some direct experience of her. And actually, I wrote quite a lot of Vanessa's diary sort of separately. Um, and quite a lot more than went in the book. I then sort of chopped pieces out of it and decided which bits I thought were actually necessary. Some of it was just me getting to know Vanessa and getting her life story straight in my head.
Mhm.
But then there were parts of it which I really wanted the reader to hear. So I can't remember exactly the progression of things. I'd sort of started writing the novel, which is mostly Becca's point of view and Grace's point of view, or the third person point of view. And then on the side, thinking where Vanessa was at this time, what she was up to. And so there were kind of two documents, and Vanessa's. Then I started selecting pieces of Vanessa's work, which appear out of sequence because her papers were a mess. she didn't date anything. Nobody knows where. So they kind of dropped in at points where I thought it was interesting for the reader to learn a bit more about what she was thinking about her island and her home and her work and her relationships and all those things.
Yeah, I mean that's what I really love because all of a sudden I just stop and we'd see words from the person, and you realize after somebody's gone, what do you have left? And I think about this a lot because everything's an email these days or text. Some of the most meaningful things you've gotten have been in email and text. Well, do you keep those? Like, where is it going to be? Where's our history later on? Where's our collection of letters that went back and forth between people that said so much? And what I loved about these letters is I really felt like I was getting to know her. And through her eyes, not through everybody else telling me who she was and what she is. But I'm really thinking about the future of where the notes and everything are going to be because it's not the same. It's just not the same. It's a bunch of typing. I've done some great
Sad, isn't it?
typing. And then you lose that
I
account
mean,
and
it's
it's
sad. I
gone.
think that we're not going to have these archives of people's writing, or perhaps we will. There'll be digital archives, but it won't be the same as going and like looking through the papers of Dylan Thomas or whatever,
Right.
or and having those whole, um, yeah, an archive. And I think there are still people who have notebooks and write things down. I mean, I have notebooks, but nobody would be able to decipher them. I
Me
can barely
too.
decipher them now.
I write notes. Like if something's done, I turn the paper over and I'll just start writing. And there's a woman that's been working with Miss Francesca, and she's got to look at the end of the day. This woman's got notes on the backs of like old interviews and everything all over the table. But where is, and then, okay, so then there's the times where I ask my kids, can you pay the phone bill? And then there are the times I'm saying what I think about them. And like, maybe I should make bigger things of Christmas cards and write really bright things in them. But it's those moments where I'm going back, even when my boys are well, I'm only 27, but they're 30 and 35. But I go back and I look at what they're like what they've done. And I was making boxes for them. And they're like, well, why do we care? And I said, someday you will care what you did in kindergarten. And I have it now, and you're going to get it.
Yeah,
Because it does say something
exactly.
about that little. I mean, I remember my one son, they had to like put a slideshow to music, and he did it to Paul Simon's Kodachrome. And I will watch, listen to that song from here on in and see all his slides coming up because it was so interesting and it was such a big part of him. But where do
Yeah.
I take that CD and where do I play it? So
No.
it's all changed, all changed. So was there one character you
Mm.
enjoyed writing more than the other? Was there one that you said, this one's easier?
I think Vanessa, I knew her the best, and those diary sections, because of the way they're written, it was quite freeing to write in that way because you're just putting her thoughts onto the page. You don't have to describe very much. You're just putting her thoughts onto the page. But honestly, I think the person who is the most fun to write is not, we haven't even talked about. Her name is Emmeline. She's this really evil old lady who works who owns the kind of the Fairburn Foundation, the foundation that owns the art. She's but I think characters who are really nasty are always fun to write. She's just so rude to everyone. And that's always fun. When you're talking about characters like Becca or Grace who are much more complicated, they're trickier. They require a lot more work. People who are straightforwardly mean are easy.
Yeah, jump on the page. There you go. No problem. Okay, so you had you writing the letters. Did you have the whole book planned in advance? Like, did you know where it was all going to go, or you just started playing as you wrote?
I always know, like, have a point that I'm aiming for at the end of the novel, sort of the whodunit part. But that's really the only thing that I know. There might be a few other points that I know that I'm going to enlarge on, but I don't like to have everything planned out. I don't find that fun. And more than anything, I couldn't do that from the beginning of a novel. I have to work my way into it to see how people feel once I start writing them, to see how they develop. I might know that a character is going to do a bad thing, but I don't know like how I'm getting to that point or why they're going to do the bad thing. What is it that really pushes them over the edge at that. And it's usually a combination of things that are building up and building up. So that tends to happen while I'm while I'm working through it. And that for me is the fun part. And you start, I think when you're in the middle of the writing, you start seeing different connections between different characters, or start realizing that a theme it's an idea is recurring and recurring. And those things I think are the really interesting things to pay attention to. In the middle of the novel, there'll always be a point where I'm like, ugh, I don't know, I can't see this properly. And then I'll stop and take a step back. And then I might start sticking post-its on the wall or whatever. So I can see outlines and things. So I can sort of see the shape of the whole novel. And then, you'll notice that maybe nothing very dramatic happens here for a bit, or we don't hear from this particular character for ages. And then you can see like how to balance things out a bit better. But that only happens when I've already written, maybe half the book. So I kind of plan it in the middle of it, which is slightly odd, but that's how it works for me.
Yeah. It's like you've got to get to a moment where you know the characters, you know what you want them to do. And then what am I going to do? Where am
Mm.
I going to go? How can I take them? And it may be we have to go here to get to here because it's going to make it more interesting for the reader. Um, so you grew up in Zimbabwe and you
Yeah.
moved to London in 1989. What was the book culture like when you were growing up? Was it a really strong book culture in Zimbabwe?
Well, I mean, not really. I used to go to the library. There weren't a lot of bookstores in Harare where I lived. So we didn't, yeah, I used to go to the library every week and get books out. And the books that were available were very British, I think. There was a lot of Enid Blyton and Agatha Christie and that kind of thing. That's what I sort of grew up reading, or traditional European fairy tales kind of thing. As a child, those were the things, and C.S. Lewis. Um, so it was very British. It was a British education system, and it was very British books,
Hmm.
which is kind of odd because I mean, they were interesting and great and what have you, but you didn't see your own experience or the landscape around you reflected anywhere in what you were reading.
Interesting. Right. So it's like I'm here, but this is like a fairy tale, the whole thing to me, because it's all a different world. This is not a world I've been in, you know?
I remember when, as a child, came to came across to the UK when I was about, I can't remember, 8 or 9, and we went to Edinburgh for the first time ever, and I was just gobsmacked because there's literally a castle on a hill, in the city, and I'd never seen such a thing. That was like something straight out of a fairy tale, as far as I was concerned. So that was quite, yeah, overwhelming.
Yeah. It's like, completely different. I read that the Blue Hour recalls the very best of Shirley Jackson and Patricia Highsmith. What does that kind of an accolade mean to you? Like you're sitting there and saying, wait, I read those people. Am I in that class?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't believe that's a very, very nice thing for somebody to say, but look at Shirley Jackson's sentences. They're so extraordinary. I love rereading her sentences that, obviously the stories are extraordinary and terrifying and strange, but it's actually the sentence level work that she does is so beautiful. She is just an absolute master stylist. And someone like Patricia Highsmith, wow. I mean, to create the sorts of characters that she created, the likes of Ripley, or is it Guy Haynes and Strangers on a Train? I mean, they are really extraordinary characters. They are the kind of characters that I think I aspire to because they're very compromised and very complicated, and there are villains. There are pretty much no heroes, but the even the good people. It is Guy Haynes, isn't it? And Strangers on a Train. They are incredibly compromised, and then even when they try to do the right thing, they somehow fail. And I'm always interested in those kind of characters and in people who fail to do the sorts of things that they're supposed to, but not because they're setting out to do a bad thing. So I'm very flattered by both those comparisons. Um, yeah, those are extraordinary
Yeah.
comparisons.
And I'm thinking because there are not that many characters in this book when it comes down to it, and we get very in depth. And I think that's the reason where people may be saying this. You're very into these characters. You know a lot about them because there aren't 33. You come down to it, how many people we're really writing about? And I think that that gives us the ability to really draw more about them and what might they possibly do goes into the reader's head. Like, okay, what are we going to do? And you don't get clues of like what really happened till later on. Like later on, you sit there and say, wait, that's how that got to there? Interesting. You know, but you've completely seen the
Yeah,
characters.
I think character is always the most important thing to me, and it's what I spend lots of time on, and I spend ages thinking about the characters before I write them, and I think a lot about what it was that shaped them and how they came to be here. That's what I'm always asking myself when I read, say, an article in the newspaper about somebody, an ordinary person who's done a terrible thing. I'm always so fascinated by what it was that led them to this point. How did they get here? This supposedly ordinary, everyday person, this person who could be your neighbor or your colleague, how on earth did they get to a point where they're doing something extraordinary and terrible? Um, so you really have to know them, and you really have to, get into those characters if you're going to do that. Because, as you say, the cast is pretty small
Mhm.
in the end.
The cast is small, but it does play such a big role because you really do get to know the people. And, a lot of people talk about the thriller and it's about the thrill that happens. But with you, I think it's about the people as much as the thrill because sometimes the people they're sort of like these kind of characters that go like this. But these are moving, I feel like, in this kind of a direction of who's going to be into whose life and who's going to move around. And I really feel that it's such a character-driven thriller. Well, Girl on the Train was a character-driven thriller, and we don't often talk about what's a character-driven thriller. We talk about what's, driven by plot or driven by this. And a lot of you writing is driven by the characters and who they are to get to do whatever they do. Yeah. Okay, we're throwing that
I
out,
think I
folks.
think character I think character determines the plot to a large degree, because the reason these stories play out the way they do is because of the particular characters in them. If you think of the girl on the train and you think of Rachel on the train there, and she witnesses something, and she only, but she, there would be no mystery if Rachel weren't who Rachel is, because
Mhm.
Rachel sees something that she interprets in her mind, because she's this lonely fantasist with this drink problem. So her character is the is the driving force rather than the plot. And that for me, that's how I like to write. And I think the very plotty, well plotted books are a joy. They're an absolute joy when you read something where somebody has just set up this extraordinary plot. That's not how I really think about things. I think about character first and setting, and then I try to work myself into a place where I can imagine that there is a plot in there. But it's
Mhm.
definitely not the thing that comes to me first.
Yeah, it's not your first thing. So talk to us about the cover. Let's first start with the title. Was this always the title, The Blue Hour?
I had another title, and I'm not going to tell you what it was because I might use it later, but it was rejected by publishers, as sometimes is the case. They didn't like it. It was difficult to translate, all these kinds of things. Anyway, there were then lots of, as you can imagine, discussions about what the cover should be. And eventually we settled on this. This was my idea. And the blue hour is that time of day when, so the sun has set, but there's still light in the sky,
Mhm.
and that kind of particular blue light that you get. And it is a time of day when sort of energy shifts, when predators come out, that kind of thing. It's also a time of day where it's very easy to mistake one thing for another. And so much of this book is about perception and about misperception, and how you might see somebody and mistake them for somebody else, or misperceive their intention towards you, and that kind of thing. So it's a beautiful title. I think it's a very artistic title. It worked on a number of levels. So I
Mhm.
do really love it. And I think that book jacket is gorgeous. So it's though you're looking out of Vanessa's house, of Grace's house, at the sea, or so you're on the island there. You're in her studio or in her bedroom, and you're looking out onto the sea.
And you're realizing how remote this really is. Immediately, you see the remoteness of it. So there you are.
Yeah.
Gemma Whalen does the audio. Have you had a chance to hear the final version yet?
I haven't listened to it all the way through yet. I've heard some clips of it, but I will. I know I haven't sat down and listened to it
Is
all.
it
It's quite. I find it quite weird to listen to somebody else reading my words back to me. You sort of like noticing things where you think, I should have done that. I should have done something different there. But anyway,
well, a couple of years ago, we were
she's a
talking
great
to authors, they
reader.
said they
She's
started
really
reading.
experienced.
Yep, they started reading their books aloud because they realized audio was going to be such a big deal. And how does it sound as opposed to how it reads? And the sound, like, wait, you can't use
Mm.
that word because that word's going to bounce off of that word. So people said they were reading their books aloud to see how it was going to work because you read quickly. Sometimes you skip words. Let's get real. I know you put them all down, but sometimes we skip them. Whereas when you're listening, there's not that skipping, oh, I'm going to skip that sentence. No, it's all there. So it's very, very interesting. It's a whole different experience.
I think it's a good idea to read your work aloud anyway to yourself because you notice the rhythm of your sentences, you notice where things are jarring a bit. I think there's a kind of musicality to it sometimes, or I think you should aim for a kind of musicality, and you won't notice that until you do read it out loud. But it's a weird thing to hear somebody else read your words back to you. Sometimes it just doesn't sound quite the way you imagined it in your head. Gemma is a great reader, and she's done a gorgeous job. She's got a great voice for it.
So there you go. So right now you're on tour. You've been UK, now they're US. You're going to Edinburgh after this. I
Mhm.
think that's the way the tour is going at this point. So are you working on anything at this point? But I'm sorry.
Um, I Not really. I have some ideas that I've been thinking about and sort of mulling over in my head, and I have some characters who I would like to write about, but I'm not exactly sure of their relationships to each other yet. So I'm still thinking about them. But I'm not one of those people who can just write, a couple of hundred words in the departure lounge at the airport. I need to be sort of sat quietly at home with a big stretch of time to really immerse myself. So yeah, I'm here and then I'll be in Europe for a while. I'm going to Spain and Portugal and Germany and various places. And then I will sit down probably in December and get my head down and hopefully start writing something.
Can you do a lot of thinking though when you're on planes because there's so little you can actually do? Like I find that there are times where I say I think I should fly to California because I need the time to not have anybody be able to find me and just like figure out my own ideas for a change instead of what everybody's asking me to do.
Well, there's disconnection, isn't there? Because you don't look at your phone all the time. I tend to read quite a bit but no, it's actually a long flight is a good time to sort of sit there and work a few things out and make notes. And yeah, because as you say, for once, you're not really reachable. Um, but I know they have Wi-Fi on planes now, but I don't. I don't. It's one of the nice things about a long flight is that just nobody can get to you for a few hours.
Yeah. I remember I used to fly to LA and I'd answer all the email on the flight out and I'd feel all caught up. And then I'd get there and it all start coming in again. And I'm like, oh no, come on, like a couple of more hours, please, a couple of more hours of not having to answer. But I do find that I can think, and I also watch other people because there's so little people watching. Like, since COVID, people are like in their homes more and things like that. The people watching has kind of changed. And to just be able to observe people and how they move around and what they do is kind of interesting. And it's when you're on a plane, you can just sit there and sort of watch, like, oh, who's putting their stuff in the overhead and then going to the back of the plane, who's doing this, because you get ideas about who people are just by their behavior getting on the plane, you know? So.
Hmm. Absolutely. Paying attention to those kind of things, I think, is very, very useful.
Yeah, yeah. It was funny. I was flying out to Colorado a couple weeks ago, and this little kid sat down next to me, and she says, "I am going to be getting up the whole flight." I thought, "Oh, that sounds great." So I'm in the aisle. We literally take off down the runway, and she and her sister fall asleep. And I was like, "This is golden. This is great. They're going to sleep the whole flight." And then they started snoring and moving around, and it was just I never thought about little kids sitting there and snoring. And they do these like abrupt move to the other side of the seat, and I said, if you're a writer that's something that's really funny to write about because you'd never normally see, you never sit there and watch a child sleep the whole night. But here I've got 4 hours of watching them move around. It's very funny. Well, such a pleasure to get to talk to you. It was so nice to meet you in New York, to get to read the book and then get to come back with questions. So I really appreciate your time.
Nice chat. Thank you.
Thank you. And good luck on your tour, like every city, because you're going to be all over.
I am. Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Thank you. Have a good day. And to everybody else, look forward to seeing you
Bye.
next time on Book Reporter Talks to.